You were the one who said yes when you meant no. You were the one who stayed in the room long after you wanted to leave, who laughed at something that wasn't funny, who softened your opinion the moment you felt pushback coming, who gave the answer you thought someone needed to hear instead of the one that was actually true. And the whole time, you called it being kind. You called it being considerate, mature, low drama, easy to get along with. But somewhere underneath the smile, something else was happening. A quiet exhaustion that never fully went away. A growing sense that the people around you knew a version of you, a very likable, very agreeable, very manageable version that wasn't entirely real. And the strangest part, you weren't even sure anymore where the performance ended and the actual person began. Psychology has a name for this pattern. It's called people pleasing. And what researchers have found after studying it is not what most people expect. Because people pleasing doesn't begin as a character flaw, it begins as a survival strategy, one that was almost certainly very smart at the time it was learned. 1. You weren't born this way. You were trained. Here is what psychology consistently finds at the origin of people pleasing behavior. Almost universally, it begins in early environments where approval was conditional, not abusive necessarily, not dramatic, just conditional. A child learns through repetition and small signals that love is more available when you are easy, that the room is safer when you don't take up too much space, that having needs creates friction, that the fastest way to feel secure is to become whatever the people around you need you to be. Psychologist Harriet Breaker, who studied people-pleasing extensively, described this as a form of learned emotional regulation. The child isn't learning to please others because it's inherently virtuous. The child is learning to please others because it works. It reduces tension. It produces warmth. It generates safety in an environment where safety felt uncertain. And here is the critical part. The strategy is never consciously chosen. It forms below awareness. By the time you're an adult, it doesn't feel like a learned behavior. It feels like your personality. It feels like who you are. That distinction matters enormously because you cannot change something you believe is simply you. 2. The version of you that everyone likes may not be you at all. There is a particular kind of loneliness that people pleasers rarely talk about. Not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who are comfortable with you, who rely on you, who genuinely like you, and feeling beneath all of that warmth, completely unknown. Because the person they like is the edited version. The version that never disagrees too strongly, never takes up too much emotional space, never arrives needing something inconvenient. The version that has learned, through years of careful calibration, exactly how to be present without ever being difficult. That version is real in some ways, but it is also a construction. And the person beneath the construction has been waiting for a very long time for someone to ask the question the edited version never gets asked. What do you actually want? Not what would make this easier, not what would keep the peace, not what everyone else seems to need from you right now. What do you want? If that question made something shift in your chest, if it felt unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable, that is worth sitting with. Because the degree to which that question feels strange is roughly the degree to which people-pleasing has replaced your actual self-knowledge with someone else's preferences. Stop here. Because before we go further, something needs to be said directly. If you recognize yourself in this, it does not mean you are weak. It does not mean you are broken. It does not mean you have been naive or foolish or easy to manipulate. It means you learned a strategy that once protected you. And it worked. It produced real things: connection, safety, belonging, approval. The problem is not that the strategy was wrong then. The problem is that you are still running a program designed for an environment that no longer exists. You are an adult now. You have choices your younger self did not have. The question is not whether you learned this pattern. The question is whether you are ready to notice it operating and decide consciously whether you want to keep paying its price. 3. The price is higher than you know. Most people who recognize people-pleasing in themselves think of it as a social habit, a tendency to avoid conflict, a preference for harmony, something relatively minor in the larger architecture of a life. Psychology describes something different. Research consistently links chronic people-pleasing to significantly elevated rates of anxiety, resentment, identity diffusion, the clinical term for not knowing who you are outside of other people's expectations, and a particular kind of exhaustion that rest doesn't fix, because it isn't physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of constant self-monitoring. Think about what people-pleasing actually requires in practice. Before every interaction, some part of your mind is running a calculation. What does this person need from me? What response will land well? Where is the edge I should not cross? What version of myself is most useful right now? That process happens fast. So fast you often don't register it as effort. But it is effort. Constant, low-grade, invisible effort. And the cumulative cost of running that calculation hundreds of times a day across years and decades is not small. There is also a second cost that is harder to see until it arrives. People-pleasing erodes trust. Not other people's trust in you. Your trust in yourself. When you say yes and mean no often enough, you lose the ability to clearly distinguish what you actually want from what you have learned to want. When you silence your real opinions consistently enough, you begin to doubt whether your real opinions are worth having. When you reshape yourself to fit each room you walk into, you stop knowing what shape you actually are. And a person who doesn't know what they want, what they think, or what they actually feel, that person is not free. They are available, which can look identical from the outside but feels entirely different from within. 4. What changing it actually looks like, and why it's harder than it sounds. Here is what most self-help advice about people-pleasing gets wrong. It tells you to set boundaries. Speak your truth. Say no more often. Learn to disappoint people. The advice isn't wrong, but it skips the part that makes it so hard to follow. When a people-pleaser begins to change, when they start saying what they actually think, taking up appropriate space, declining things that cost too much, the people around them often react. Sometimes with confusion, sometimes with subtle pressure, sometimes with something that looks a lot like withdrawal of warmth. And to a nervous system that was wired to experience that withdrawal as danger, the reaction is not just social discomfort. It registers somewhere older and deeper as threat. This is why people-pleasers don't change simply by deciding to change. The behavior is not a conscious choice anymore. It is a physiological response. And the path through it requires something more than willpower. It requires, as psychologists who study attachment and identity formation describe it, the slow and patient work of building a self that does not require external approval to feel safe. That process is not fast, but it has a shape, and the shape begins with one specific shift. The shift from approval-seeking to self-authority. Somewhere, for different people, it comes at different ages, under different circumstances. Something tips. A relationship ends and you realize you gave more of yourself to keeping it than it was ever worth. A conflict arrives that you don't manage away, and nothing terrible happens. Someone withdraws their approval and the world does not end. You say something true and difficult, and the person you said it to respects you more for it, not less. These moments are small, but they are seismic, because they challenge the foundational assumption that people-pleasing is built on, that your value to other people is contingent on your usefulness to them, that you are only safe when you are easy, that the real you, with actual needs and opinions and limits, is too much. What psychologists who study identity development describe happening in this shift is not a sudden burst of confidence. It is something quieter and more durable, a gradual, experience by experience accumulation of evidence that you can be honest and still be loved, that you can disappoint someone and still be okay, that the self you have been protecting others from is not the threat you were taught it was. And slowly, not overnight, not without difficulty, but steadily, the calculation changes. You stop asking, what do they need from me? You start asking, what is actually true here? That shift from approval-seeking to self-authority is not the end of caring about other people. People who have made this shift often become more genuinely kind, not less. because their kindness is no longer driven by fear of what happens if they aren't. It is chosen freely. It comes from a self that is present rather than managed. There is a version of you that says what it means. That shows up as it actually is. That can sit in a room and let someone be disappointed without immediately trying to fix it. That version is not difficult. It is not selfish. It is not too much. It is just real. And real, it turns out, is the only thing that can be genuinely close to another person. Because closeness requires that there actually be someone there. The person you've been protecting people from, the one with the opinions and the needs and the edges that don't always smooth away, that person is not a problem to be managed. That person is who you actually are. And they have been waiting, quietly, for a very long time. Which part of this landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to? Leave it in the comments. Not because it will fix anything, but because somewhere in that comment section is someone who has been carrying the exact same thing in silence. And your honesty might be the first time they've ever seen it named.